Last night, my wife and I went to see a movie called Skyscraper. It was decent, and we got back home around 9 in the evening. We live in a fairly new housing development. It's a middle to upper middle class neighborhood that feels pretty safe. Instead of individual mailboxes in front of each house, ours are grouped together at the end of the street. Because of that, we don't always check the mail regularly. But I knew I had a package arriving from Amazon. So we stopped by the mailboxes. The package was there, along with a letter addressed to me in a typed envelope. The return address didn't have a name, only a street from the block behind ours. Since we don't really know anyone around here well yet, I opened it while we were driving. What I read completely shocked me. The letter said, "We are watching you, Mr. Sex Pervert." There was also a drawing of 2 creepy eyes. I was stunned. When we got home, my wife was upset, and I was both angry and confused. Just to be clear, I'm not actually a pervert. As far as I know, I'm a faithful husband to my wife. We don't have any strange fetishes. No one has ever accused me of anything perverted in my entire life. And I honestly can't think of anything I've done that could give that impression. If anything, my wife has joked that I'm too boring. Anyway, at my wife's insistence, I called the sheriff's department. They agreed the situation was creepy and said they would send someone out, although they couldn't guarantee when. Then things started getting even stranger. We had only been home for about 5 minutes when our car alarm suddenly began going off. That had happened before because I sometimes accidentally press the panic button in my pocket. But this time I was inside near the window trying to press the stop button and it wouldn't turn off. Already in a bad mood, I got frustrated and threw the key fob down, accidentally breaking it. My wife eventually turned the alarm off using her key fob. After that, we decided to drive around and see which house the return address referred to before the sheriff arrived. It turned out that the house number listed didn't actually exist. For some reason, that number had been skipped when the street was numbered. If it had existed, though, it would have been almost directly behind our house. When we pulled back up near our home, our next-door neighbors and the people across the street were standing outside talking excitedly. We walked over to see what was happening. Apparently, while our car alarm was going off, our neighbor's car alarm had started too. They had their car parked in the street between our houses. I hadn't heard theirs because mine was also blaring, but they definitely heard both. The neighbor across the street came outside after hearing the alarms. Right in front of his house, he saw a man sitting in a black car with the lights off. As soon as the neighbor stepped outside, the car sped off down the road without turning its lights on. The neighbor even chased it on foot for a short distance, trying to get the license plate. But it was too dark, and the car got away. So he called the sheriff as well. About 5 minutes later, 2 deputies arrived at almost the exact same time. One was responding to my call, and the other to the neighbors. They honestly had no idea what to make of the situation. They asked if I had enemies, a bad ex, family conflicts, or if I'd ever been accused of anything before. But the truthful answer to every question was no. They took a report anyway. They collected the letter as evidence and gave me a card in case anything else happened. I barely slept that night. I was just completely confused and uneasy. I don't know most of my neighbors very well, except the ones next door. Not many people even know my address. Since the letter used a return address from the street behind us that doesn't exist, it felt like whoever sent it knew the area. My name and address are listed on the HOA website, which could be how they found my name. But I truly haven't done anything wrong. My imagination started running wild, trying to figure it out. I kept wondering if the car had just been a coincidence. Was the person who sent the letter just crazy? My wife was scared, but she believed me. I still had no idea what to do next, or why someone would do something like that. First, I need to mention that this story was told to me by my grandmother. She has an incredible memory for details and can describe something from 50 years ago as if it happened just last week. This took place sometime in the late 1970s in the metropolitan Detroit area. Back then, my grandparents lived out in what people would call the middle of nowhere. Their home sat on a dirt road, surrounded mostly by fields, woods, and a few farms about a mile to the north. Their house was set on 10 acres and positioned back from the road. About 200 feet to the right was my great-grandparents' house. On both sides of their property, there were roughly half a mile of fields before reaching a main road. My grandparents lived there with their 3 kids, and my grandpa worked the midnight shift at a nearby auto plant. One night, my grandma was sitting alone watching TV. It was around 11 or maybe midnight when she heard someone knock on the front door. She looked through the front window and, in the moonlight, noticed there wasn't any car in the driveway or anywhere on the road. I have to give her credit because she reacted quickly in that moment. They lived in a tri-level house, meaning the basement was partly underground, and the upper level wasn't as high as a typical 2-story home. She went upstairs to their bedroom and opened the window that was directly above the front step. Looking down, she saw a man standing at the door. She called down to him and asked what he needed. He told her that his car had broken down up the road and that he had walked over hoping he could use her phone. He said he was on his way to his girlfriend's house, which was up at the corner. The problem with his explanation was that where he claimed his car had broken down, he would have only been a couple hundred yards from his girlfriend's place. Instead of walking there, he had walked half a mile back down the road to her house. That's when she realized something about his story didn't make sense and told him she couldn't help him. The man started getting irritated and begged her to please let him use the phone. He promised he would be quick and leave right away. While she was leaning out the window telling him he needed to leave, she suddenly heard fast footsteps crunching across the gravel driveway somewhere in the darkness. Right after that came a loud crashing sound as another man suddenly came flying out from beside the garage and slammed onto the ground. At that moment, the man standing on the porch spun around and ran off into the night. She looked toward the driveway again and saw that the man on the ground had a third man on top of him, repeatedly punching him in the face. A moment later, the man getting beaten managed to break free and ran off into the darkness after the first guy. What my grandma didn't realize during the conversation at the door was that the man's accomplice had been pressed flat against the front of the house near the garage. They had been waiting for her to open the door so they could rush inside and do who knows what. But what they didn't know was that my cousin was visiting my great-grandmother next door that night. He happened to be sitting at the kitchen table and saw the 2 men walk toward the house. He also watched one of them hide while the other started knocking. He immediately ran outside and sprinted over, attacking the man who was hiding. The guy dropped instantly. A little side note is that my cousin was actually a boxing champion in the Naval Pacific Fleet at that time. My grandma called the police, but unfortunately the 2 men and their vehicle were never located. However, one of them definitely left with a reminder of the encounter, because 2 of his teeth were found on the ground. My grandma still keeps those teeth today as a souvenir in a small glass bottle. A few years ago, I was staying home alone while my parents were out of town for the weekend. At the time, I was about 16 years old. Our house sits on a quiet suburban street where nothing unusual really ever happens. That night, I was in the living room playing video games and talking to a friend online. It was probably around 1 a.m. when I first heard something outside. At first, I assumed it was just the wind or maybe a raccoon going through the trash. But after a few minutes, I heard it again. This time it sounded like someone walking slowly across the gravel near our driveway. I muted my game and listened carefully. The sound stopped for a moment. Then I heard a light tapping on the window next to the front door. It wasn't loud, just a few soft taps. My stomach immediately dropped. No one should have been outside our house at that time of night. I stayed completely still and waited to see if it would happen again. After a few seconds, the tapping started again, a little louder this time. I slowly stood up and turned off the lights in the living room. Then I moved quietly toward the window, but stayed far enough away so no one could see me from outside. From the angle I was standing, I could barely see the front porch, but I could definitely see that someone was standing there. It looked like a tall man wearing a dark hoodie. He was leaning slightly toward the window, as if trying to look inside. I immediately backed away and grabbed my phone. My first instinct was to call my dad. When he answered, I told him someone was outside the house. He told me to lock every door and call the police right away. While I was on the phone with him, I suddenly heard the doorknob being tested. The person outside was slowly turning it back and forth, like they were checking if it was locked. My heart started pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. I ran into the kitchen and double-checked the back door to make sure it was locked. Then I went upstairs to my parents' bedroom, because that was the only room with a clear view of the driveway. From the window, I could see the front of the house better. The man was still standing on the porch. For a moment, he just stood there completely still. Then he stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the side of the house. I immediately lost sight of him. That made everything feel even worse, because now I had no idea where he was. I called 911 and tried to explain what was happening while whispering. The operator told me officers were on the way. While I was on the phone, I heard another noise downstairs. It sounded like someone walking across the wooden deck in the backyard. At that point, I locked myself in my parents' bedroom and waited. Every little sound made me jump. It felt like the longest 15 minutes of my life. Finally, I saw red and blue lights flashing through the front windows. The police searched around the property, but they never found the man. They said whoever it was probably ran off when they saw the patrol car coming down the street. Even now, I still think about how long that person might have been standing outside, watching the house, before I noticed. This happened when I was about 12 years old. At the time, my family lived in a small neighborhood near the edge of town. Behind our house, there was a large wooded area. My friends and I used to explore those woods almost every day after school. There were a few old trails that people had made over the years. Most of the time, we just rode our bikes or walked around looking for interesting things. One afternoon, I decided to go into the woods by myself. My friends were busy that day, and I was bored. The weather was nice, and it was still early in the evening. I followed one of the trails that led deeper into the trees. After about 10 minutes of walking, I noticed something strange. There was a small clearing that I had never seen before. In the middle of the clearing, there was an old camping chair. Next to it sat a small cooler and a plastic bag. It looked like someone had been sitting there recently. At first, I assumed it belonged to a hunter, but it wasn't hunting season. I walked a little closer to look around. Inside the cooler, there were a few empty soda cans. The plastic bag had some snack wrappers inside it. The chair was pointed directly toward the trail I had just walked down. That made me feel a little uneasy. It almost looked like someone had been sitting there watching the path. I suddenly had the feeling that I shouldn't be there. So I decided to head back toward the neighborhood. As I turned around to leave, I heard a branch snap somewhere behind me in the woods. I froze and listened carefully. For a moment, everything was completely quiet. Then I heard another faint sound, like someone slowly moving through the leaves. My heart started pounding. I didn't wait to see what it was. I immediately started walking quickly back toward the trail. After a few seconds, I began running. I didn't look back the entire time. When I finally reached the edge of the woods near the houses, I stopped to catch my breath. I stood there for a minute listening. The woods behind me were completely silent again. I never went back to that clearing after that day. This happened to me when I was in high school. At the time, I worked a part-time job at a small grocery store near my house. My shift usually ended around 10 p.m. Since I didn't have a car yet, I normally walked home. The walk only took about 15 minutes. Most of the route went through a quiet residential neighborhood. One night, I left work a little later than usual. It was already close to 10:30 p.m. The streets were almost completely empty. As I started walking down the sidewalk, I noticed a man standing near the corner of the block. He was leaning against a streetlight and looking down at his phone. At first, I didn't pay much attention to him. People often stopped there to wait for rides. As I got closer, he looked up and watched me for a moment. I kept walking without making eye contact. When I passed him, he didn't say anything. But a few seconds later, I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced back and saw that he had started walking in the same direction. That didn't seem too strange at first. He could have just been heading the same way. But after a few blocks, I noticed he was still directly behind me. Every time I slowed down slightly, his pace slowed as well. When I walked a little faster, he sped up too. That's when I started to feel uncomfortable. I decided to cross the street to see if he would keep following. A few seconds later, he crossed the street as well. At that point, I was pretty sure he was intentionally staying behind me. My house was still about 5 minutes away. I didn't want him to know where I lived. So instead of turning toward my street, I continued walking straight. Up ahead, there was a small convenience store that stayed open late. The lights inside were still on. As I approached the store, I could hear the man's footsteps getting closer. I quickly walked inside the store without looking back. The cashier looked up as I came in. I pretended to look at the shelves for a minute while trying to see through the front window. The man walked past the store without stopping. He didn't even glance inside. I waited there for about 10 minutes before leaving. When I finally walked outside again, the street was completely empty. This happened to me a few years ago when I was driving home late from work. At the time, I worked the night shift at a warehouse about 30 minutes from my house. My shift usually ended around 1 a.m. Most nights, the drive home was quiet and uneventful. The roads were almost always empty at that hour. One night, I noticed a car pull onto the road behind me shortly after I left work. At first, I didn't think anything about it. It's normal for other workers to leave around the same time. But after about 10 minutes, I realized the car was still directly behind me. Every time I turned, it turned as well. That's when I started paying closer attention. The car kept a consistent distance behind me the entire time. It wasn't extremely close, but it also never fell far back. Eventually, I turned onto a smaller road that leads toward my neighborhood. Very few people use that road late at night. When the car turned behind me again, I started to feel uneasy. I decided to test something. Instead of going straight home, I made an extra turn onto another street. The car followed me again. At that point, I was almost certain the driver was following me. My heart started beating faster as I tried to figure out what to do. I didn't want to lead a stranger directly to my house. So instead, I drove toward a nearby gas station that stays open all night. The gas station was brightly lit and usually had at least a few people around. As I pulled into the parking lot, the car slowed down. For a moment, it looked like the driver might follow me inside, but then the car continued driving past the entrance and disappeared down the road. I sat in the parking lot for several minutes, just trying to calm down. Eventually, I went inside and bought a drink, so it didn't look like I had just pulled in for no reason. After about 15 minutes, I drove home without seeing the car again. Even now, I still wonder if the person had actually been following me, or if it was just a strange coincidence. But the way they copied every turn I made still doesn't feel like an accident. This happened when I was in college during my sophomore year. At the time, I lived in a small off-campus apartment with one roommate. Our building was old and only had 6 units in total. It sat at the end of a quiet street, about 10 minutes from campus. One weekend, my roommate went home to visit his family. That left me alone in the apartment for 2 nights. The first night was completely normal. I stayed up late studying and watching videos. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was coming from outside the building. It sounded like someone slowly walking in the hallway. Since the floors were old, footsteps echoed pretty clearly through the walls. I assumed it was just one of the neighbors coming home late. But the footsteps didn't stop. They moved slowly back and forth past our apartment door several times. After a few minutes, I started to feel uneasy. Most people in the building worked early in the morning and usually went to bed before midnight. It was strange for someone to be pacing the hallway at around 3 in the morning. I checked my phone to confirm the time. It was 3:07 a.m. The footsteps continued for another minute. Then they stopped directly outside our door. I held my breath and listened carefully. Everything went completely quiet. Then I heard the sound of someone lightly touching the doorknob. They didn't try to force it open. They just slowly turned it once and then let go. A few seconds later, the footsteps started again. This time they moved toward the stairwell at the end of the hall. I stayed awake for almost an hour, listening for any other sounds. Eventually, everything went silent again. The next morning, I asked my neighbors if anyone had come home late the night before. Everyone said they had been asleep. One neighbor even mentioned that she heard the same footsteps during the night. She assumed it was someone visiting another apartment, but none of us could figure out who it might have been. What bothered me the most was the way the person stopped right outside our door and touched the handle. It felt like whoever it was had been checking to see if the apartment was locked. This happened a few years ago when I was working the closing shift at a small convenience store. The store was located on the edge of town near a quiet highway. Most nights were pretty slow, especially after midnight. Usually only a few customers would come in for gas or snacks. On this particular night, I was working alone. My coworker had left around 11, and I was scheduled to close at 2 in the morning. At around 1:15 a.m., a man walked into the store. At first, there didn't seem to be anything unusual about him. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He walked slowly through the aisles, looking at different items. I greeted him like I normally did with customers. He didn't respond and just kept walking. That immediately felt a little strange, but not alarming. Some people just don't like talking. After a minute, he came up to the counter with a bottle of water. When I told him the total, he stared at me for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he slowly reached into his pocket. For a moment, I thought he was pulling out his wallet. Instead, he placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. I looked down at it, confused. Written on the paper were the words, "Don't make a sound." Underneath the words, there was a drawing of what looked like a gun. My heart immediately started racing. I looked back up at him, and he was staring directly at me. Then he quietly lifted his jacket, just enough for me to see the handle of a handgun in his waistband. He didn't say a single word. He just tapped the paper again with his finger. At that moment, I realized he was robbing the store. Trying to stay calm, I slowly opened the register. I took out the cash and placed it on the counter like he wanted. The entire time he kept watching me without saying anything. After I pushed the money toward him, he grabbed it quickly and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. Then he picked up the bottle of water and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around and looked at me one more time. For a second, I thought he might say something. Instead, he simply walked out into the parking lot. As soon as he was outside, I locked the door and called the police. When officers arrived, they checked the security cameras. Unfortunately, the man had parked his car out of view of the cameras. All they could see was him walking into the store and leaving a few minutes later. They told me that robberies like that sometimes happen along the highway. Travelers stop late at night when stores are empty. Even though no one was hurt, the whole experience shook me up pretty badly. For weeks after that, I felt nervous every time someone walked into the store late at night.